Well, as with everything in my life, I don't do things by halves, so I didn't sort of have a minor failure. I actually failed the biggest single thing I could possibly have ever failed, not only in my career, but in my whole life. But, once you've been working for an airline for a few years, you work your way up to be in a position where you're ready to take command and become a captain. So I had entered the command process. There's psych interviews and assessment flights and all kinds of things like that. And I was partway through that process, and what I'm kind of building up to is that I failed my first command course, and it was a catastrophic, major failure for me because it did nearly break me. But what had happened in the run-up to that was that I had started to feel very tired, and basically after several weeks of tests and investigations, I lost my medical. Well, actually, my GP at the time thought I had multiple sclerosis. They don't know how I got something that attacked the myelin sheath around my spinal cord, and all the big muscles in my body stopped working. And this paralysis was starting to progress towards my heart and lungs. I was lucky to survive. I was told that by my neurologist. And initially, the prognosis was that I might be able to walk 10 metres unaided and would spend the rest of my life in a wheelchair.
Emma, that was quite a year. So you've got your parents' house burning down, moving base, brother having a bike accident, and you're trying to do flying training all together. So how did you compartmentalise the two?
Well, I think that partly because those things didn't happen to me personally, they happened to people around me. And I know that sounds a bit callous, but actually it wasn't my house that burnt down. It wasn't me that had the accident. It wasn't me that got diabetes. It wasn't my job. So it was kind of easier in a sense to process because the things that directly impacted me hadn't been affected. They were surrounding me, but I was able to detach myself from it. And that goes back to this thing I've been reading recently about how in our industry, or as a pilot, you do have to emotionally detach yourself from things that are going wrong around you. And actually working was a bit of an escape as well, because I couldn't think about those things when I was at work because I had to fly the aircraft. So actually being able to push them to the side for a bit, during my working day, it was kind of nice. It gave me a rest. So, and again, just that sort of resilience. But a long time before that, I can remember sitting in my dad's office with him the other side of the desk from me, and probably talking to him about some catastrophe that wasn't really a catastrophe, but my teenage self decided was the end of the world. And he said, "Darling, you've just got to learn to compartmentalise these things." And I said, what are you talking about? Don't tell me this, my life is ruined. And he said, "Look, darling, just put things into boxes in your head and put lids on the ones that you can't deal with at the moment." And I was like, wow, that's cool. And that's what I've always done. And sometimes when things have been very overwhelming, I've even written things down on pieces of paper and put them in a box and put the lid on it, because I'm like, now I'm not dealing with you.
Wow.
You have to wait. And I know that sounds a bit nuts, but actually it's a really powerful tool to be able to visualize, the fact that you've got all these things going on and you're literally parking them somewhere else until you can come back and do something about them. And funny old thing, nothing's ever gone wrong in my life by me not answering some emails for a few days or by me putting something in a box, In fact, only good things can come from that, because often it is better to leave, especially big things, until you've got time to deal with them properly.
That's a really powerful story, and that's, just hearing you physically compartmentalising, not just mentally, but physically doing that and actually processing that. I think that's something that certainly I've taken away from our chat today, that I'm now going to try moving forwards and actually compartmentalising physically by writing things. And
I'm a really visual person. I always have really struggled to learn things from a book. I learn from pictures so much more better. But actually, one of the other things I do is, at the moment particularly, I've got a lot on. I run, a charity and 2 businesses of my own, and I'm, involved in lots of other charities, and I do loads of other things. And I literally sometimes sit down and draw a mind map of each thing. I'll sit down with 6 pieces of paper and go, okay, what's going on at Wingman at the moment? What's going on in my art business? What's going on in my speaking business? What's going on with this charity? And I write down all the things so that I can physically kind of see what my head's trying to process, because it helps me to understand, I know I'm completely overloaded, but I know I can do that day. I can do that day. I do plan my days out quite strictly. I completely cope if something goes wrong. I don't sort of have a tantrum if, at 10 past 10, the dog doesn't actually get walked. I literally write dog walks into my day as well, because I find I need that structure. But I do sometimes need to be able to do that so I can just see how much my head's processing at any one time. I find it really helpful. It's a really sort of silly tool that I use, but it's really helpful for me to sometimes to actually realise that it's not as busy as I think it is. I'm just not separating things out as much as I could be.
It's a really powerful way of processing things that are going on and realising maybe my stress bucket's a bit too full and I need to offload or say no. What advice would you give someone who's used to saying, yes, okay, yeah, I'll do that, to go, actually, no, I can't do that and I'm sorry I can't help you? How would you say that they can help find that courage maybe to say no?
Well, I think pause before you jump into things. You don't have to instantly, always sleep on something. Never rush in and say straight away, I'm going to sort this situation. I mean, I'm not talking about somebody who's having a heart attack on the street in front of you, probably help straight away then. But, when it comes to people dumping their emotional bags of whatever on your table, you can choose whether or not they leave it there. And I've got a friend who's a doctor, and I said, how do you deal with this stuff? Every day you must see people who come into your office and they basically dump their emotional bags on your table. How do you not get affected by that? And he said to me, basically, they're allowed to come in and put the bag on the table, but they've got to take it with them when they go. It's not my bag. I don't need to carry it. I thought, that's great. It's a great image to sort of carry with you. And since then, that's what I've done. I've kind of gone, well, your emotional bag can sit on the table while we're talking, but just so we're clear, you're going to be carrying it away from this conversation, not me. And which doesn't mean I've stopped caring about people, but I think you've just got to understand, are you really helping someone if you say, yeah, I'll do this, I'll do that, or are you actually going to make it worse for people? Because in the end, you realise you've taken on too much and you can't actually bake 40 cakes before you take someone else's children to school in the morning and then walk their dog for your neighbour because she's old and needs some help. And, are you just rushing around and not allowing people to get any of you, and especially not spending the time with the people that really matter, which is your family and your close friends. And you could spend all of your time, and this happened a lot when I was working. I found myself always saying to my parents, I won't have time to see you tomorrow because I've got to go to work, because I was commuting. And now I say to my parents, should we go for lunch? Because I've got time to spend with them. I don't want to spend my life looking back after they've gone and wishing I'd spent more time with them. I'd much rather have the opportunity to just slow down a bit and do the things that I'm doing well. And that would be my advice, would be just do less well. You are in control of what you take on board. You are in control of your life, even when it feels like you're not. And yeah, absolutely, things are going to happen that are outside of your control, but you can control how you respond to it.
What I'm interested to hear about are your core values, because I think if we don't do things that align with our core values, we could end up being unhappy and not doing the best job, like you said, and maybe letting people down. So what would you say your core values are and how that's shaped the things that you've done?
I think that ultimately everything I do in life is about making things better for other people. And that's it. There's with one other thing added in, which is just be kind. Because if you think about, you could just go down the news headlines every single day and you think, if people had been kind in that situation, there would be no news story. If people had been kind in that situation, there'd be no news story. So actually kindness and a genuine desire to make things better for other people, whether it is helping someone across the road with their shopping, or whether it is talking about how somebody can implement a decision-making process into their day-to-day life, it doesn't really matter what you're doing. But if the way you operate is always about making things better for other people, that's it for me. That's I have one core value, basically. I'm not a very complicated person.
So what about though saying no and maybe feeling guilty about saying no? How do you process that?
Well, that's something I think that we have to really work on, because saying no means that you could feel like you're letting someone down, but actually you're letting them down more if you're not really able to help them, you haven't really got the time to give them. So giving yourself permission to say no to things is really important, but equally giving yourself permission to take time to do those things that, particularly, if you're a busy working mum and you don't get time to go and do things at the gym or whatever, or go for a run or have that quiet space, give yourself permission to do that. You owe it to yourself. There's no one to apologise to for saying, I'm taking time out for myself today. It's not like you're saying, I'm going to go off on holiday for 3 weeks without the children and good luck. You're literally just saying, if I don't do this, I'm probably going to break at some point. So we have to sort of allow ourselves to do the things that are good for us.
It's a really powerful way of processing things that are going on and realising maybe my stress bucket's a bit too full and I need to offload or say no. Or maybe, I can actually delegate something.
That's really important, particularly as a working parent. And it doesn't have to be just the woman that needs this. My brother-in-law is the main caregiver to his 2 boys. And delegation is something that we're bad at. I'm definitely bad at. If somebody says to me, can I help you with this? I'm always like, no, it's fine. I've got it. Don't worry. I'll carry my own bag. If I can't carry it, I shouldn't have brought it, kind of thing. Or, no, don't worry. I know my husband's gone away for 6 months, but no, you really don't need to cook for me. What? Actually, yes, please bring it on. Yes, I'd love you to cook for me. Please come and clean my house. I will pay you. But we don't have to do everything ourselves. It's okay to pay for childcare. It's okay to pay for a cleaner. It's okay to pay for someone to iron your shirts. It's okay to pay for someone to cook for you if you need them to. Whatever you need people to do for you, it doesn't have to be paid. But if somebody says to you, can I help you with that? Can I take the load off you a bit? Try and answer all the time. Yes, please. I would love to go for that run. Thank you very much. Good luck.
Here are my children.
Yes.
Catch.
I may not be back for several weeks. But, absolutely accept help where it's offered, because we don't need to we don't need to make martyrs of ourselves.
And
it's not heroic
help.
To do that.
But also asking for help. I think it's very hard to ask for help. I think we often feel like we should be seen to be juggling all these things and wearing all these hats, and sometimes you need to ask for help.
Absolutely. And, COVID kind of brought that to the fore, didn't it? Because there was this whole thing about ships in a storm, and we're not in the same boat as each other all the time. There's no such thing as the same boat. At that time, we were all in the same storm, but in different boats. And sometimes you'd be in an ocean liner and it would all feel fairly smooth, and other times you'd be in a leaky canoe. And the secret bit isn't offering help to people in need. The secret is being in the leaky canoe and being willing to being willing to accept the life raft when it's being thrown to you. We don't have to be sitting in the leaky canoe all the time. If people are offering to help, take the help where it's offered.
So speaking about asking for help and moving on to failure as well, which sort of kind of goes hand in hand with asking for help, tell me about any failures that you had through your airline career that you think that we can learn from in terms of how you dealt with it and processed and moved forward.
Well, as with everything in my life, I don't do things by halves. So I didn't sort of have a minor failure. I actually failed the biggest single thing I could possibly have ever failed, not only in my career, but in my whole life. And I was in my 40s before I failed anything at all. I had never failed at anything, partly through choice, because, I kind of realised I'm never going to be good at golf, so I've never played it. So sometimes I sort of manage the things I don't fail at. But so I basically, it's a natural thing. Once you've been working for an airline for a few years, you work your way up to be in a position where you're ready to take command and become a captain. So I had entered the command process while I was working at Stansted, and there's a process involved in that. I'm sure people who aren't aware of this process will be very pleased to hear that they don't just give them out on back of cereal packets, but you do actually, it's quite an involved process. There's psych interviews and assessment flights and all kinds of things like that. And I was partway through that process, and what I'm kind of building up to is that I failed my first command course. And I'm not in any way embarrassed about that. I call it Command Course 1 because I think it sounds a bit cooler than the one I failed. It sounds a bit more like Air Force 1. But and obviously I went on to pass the second time because I am a captain. But I did fail at that, and it was a catastrophic, major failure for me because it did nearly break me. But what had happened in the run up to that was that I had started to feel very tired, and I was running and playing tennis every day. We were living at RAF Halton at the time. And basically, after several weeks of tests and investigations, I lost my medical because, well, actually, my GP at the time thought I had multiple sclerosis. I had started falling over randomly while sober, and I was weak. I couldn't hold my hands up above my head for long enough to even wash my hair. I was still flying though, because, you know, you can't let the side down, can you? And one day at work, I had actually dropped a pen on the floor. I was standing talking to a very good friend I'd gone through type rating with, and who can still make me cry just by looking at me because we have the same sense of humour. And I bent down to pick the pen up, and he looked down and laughed at me. And I said, "Can you help me stand up?" And he sort of went, "Yeah, whatever." And I went, "No, I actually can't stand up." And he said, "Are you all right?" And I said, "No, I don't think I am." And I had my medical withdrawn that day. And ultimately, I was diagnosed with something called acquired idiopathic demyelinating polyneuropathy, which basically means they don't know how I got something that attacked the myelin sheath around my spinal cord, and all the big muscles in my body stopped working. And this paralysis was starting to progress towards my heart and lungs. So I was breathless and weak and couldn't always walk. And I was very, very lucky because there was a cure for that. I was taken into hospital to spend a week on a drip, and it shut my immune system down and cured me, basically. That's a very short version of what was actually a very traumatic time in my life, because I was lucky to survive. I was told that by my neurologist. And initially, the prognosis was that I might be able to walk 10 metres unaided, and would spend the rest of my life in a wheelchair. So the fact that actually there was this cure was amazing. It gave me a second chance at life, and it has changed everything I've done as a result of that.
Your outlook as well, and
Yes.
how you deal with things, how you process things.
Very much so, because I was already the kind of person who grabbed every opportunity and made the most of it as far as I could. I had learned to do that. I'd been presented with the ability to do that over the years. But suddenly I realised how grateful I was for everything I have and everything I had, because, you know, when you realise that you may not survive, or if you survive, you may not walk again, you're a very active person, suddenly it kind of sharpens the mind a little bit. And yeah, it just made me really grateful for everybody in my life and every opportunity I had and all the things I could do and all the things that I was able to, you know, my job and my friends and all of those sorts of things. I was already grateful for them, but it just gave me this complete, it was like, I guess it was like opening a window, and it probably shaped what I've gone on to do to a large extent. But after I got my medical back, I had 6 months off work, and it was during that time that we moved to Bushy, and I turned up with no identity, basically. I was an airline captain that wasn't flying. I was a mother whose children were at boarding school. I was a physically active person who couldn't even walk down the street without falling over. And I kind of felt a bit lost, and I didn't really know who I was. And I didn't know what to do with myself either. I was really bored because I couldn't go to work, and I couldn't do the stuff that I loved doing. And I joined the Military Wives Choir. And it was amazing because we still, even though none of us have been in the same choir or sung together for a lot of years, they are still some of my closest friends. And we have really got each other through some really awful times. You know, my illness was awful for me, but there were members of that choir who lost children. One of our friends who was a member of the choir died of bowel cancer last year, you know, and we have always stuck together through all of that. We meet up, we laugh a lot, and they were an amazing group of women who I feel like I was given to help me find myself again after I'd gone through this really quite dark place where I was a bit lost. And that was a real gift. And then I went back to work in the January of that year, of the following year, and I leapt back into the command process too quickly because I had been told, we'll just park your position, and as soon as you're ready, you just hit go and we'll put you back in the process. And I was so desperate, I think, to prove that I could do it. I was so hungry for the goal of captain, but I was also desperate to prove that I was an active human being again.
So as much to yourself as to everybody else, it was...
Absolutely. I needed to prove to myself that I could still be that active, sporty person, and I was still cool because I could still fly, because obviously it's a really cool job. But
you sort of lost your identity, I guess, before that. So it's about rediscovering yourself. And
yeah, I needed to get it back. I needed to find it again. And as part of that process, I took on I did the Palace to Palace bike ride for the Prince's Trust from Buckingham Palace to Windsor Castle with no training 2 days after that I'd seen the neurologist. And he said, yeah, you seem to have made a good recovery. Let's keep going with the consultations. I didn't tell him I was doing the bike ride because I knew there's a sweeper bus. And I thought, well, what's the worst that can happen? What could possibly go wrong with this? I hadn't done any training. I just got on this bike and I did the whole race, and it was brilliant. I loved it. I was slow, but I did it. And then, well, a few months later, and this is probably more stupid, well, this is definitely more stupid. Our children went out and they had to do projects so our son went to Thailand to build water tanks and a road for a school in Chiang Mai. But they had to raise the money to do it. So as part of this, he said, well, let's do a sponsored bike ride. Let's cycle from Waterloo in London to Waterloo in Belgium, because that's not hard, is it? It's only 300 miles. And again, like he and my husband trained for it. And I was driving some of it, but I also did most of the bike ride with no training, having only just recovered from this life-threatening illness. And basically, it didn't work out that well for my back. So I achieved the ride. We even managed to get back into the country, even though my husband had left with no passport, not realising. And fortunately, because he's in the Air Force, he was able to get back in on his Air Force ID. But my back did not like that at all. And I ignored it. I just thought, I'll get the command course out of the way and then I'll sort my back out. Big mistake, massive mistake. Because, if you have something like a back problem, that's never going to be made better by stress. And a command course, arguably, even if you're well prepared for it, is probably one of the most stressful things you will ever do in your airline career. And so basically 3 sims into the simulator part of the ground school, I failed a sim, which was devastating. The instructor was amazing. He was so kind. My sim partner was wonderfully supportive as well, but ultimately I'd failed the sim. I repeated it the next day and passed it, but the different instructor noticed that I was limping on the way back to the hotel, and he said, what's going on with you? And I told him, and he went, and you're on the command course because? And I was like, yeah, I know, but I've just got to get it out of the way. But I woke up, the decision was taken out of my hands because I woke up the next day pretty much paralysed. I couldn't get out of bed. And I phoned this instructor and said, can you please deal with the company? I'm now going to have to just take myself off this course because I can't move. Ended up in loads of painkillers. I did go back and finish the command course, but by then my colleagues had moved on. They were getting their line checks and I was still in the sim. The momentum had been lost. And the decision I should have made was to say, thank you very much. I need to go back in the right-hand seat until I've sorted my back out and I'll try again another time. But I wanted to press on and prove something to myself. And ultimately, I passed all the other simulator checks, but ultimately I failed the final one, which is the big one that signs you off. And it was, I was sitting in the debriefing room with my instructor at 2 a.m. He'd sent the other pilot home because they'd brought in actual first officers to fly with me. And he was kind of a friend because we both flew at Luton, and he was, again, really kind. He went, I'm really sorry, but I can't pass you. And I said, no, I know you can't. It's fine. It wasn't fine, obviously, and I was crying in front of him. And I said, I'm not embarrassed to be crying in front of you. I was really annoyed with myself. I was embarrassed as well. It was that whole thing where I felt like I'd let myself down, the company down, my family down. I just felt shame because how could I have failed something like that? I knew I was a good pilot. So how could I have failed something that I had prepared so well for? And it's basically because I rushed back into it too soon after illness and ignored my body saying, you shouldn't be doing this yet. You'd think having nearly died the year before, you'd think I would have listened the second time, but I hadn't quite learnt my lesson. So basically, that was it. I was, I'd failed my command course. There were people in the company who campaigned quite hard for me to be allowed to do the line training and then do the simulator check at the end. But ultimately, it was too big a risk for the company to take, and I fully respect that. And I had a choice, because I could have lashed out at the company and said, you shouldn't have put me in the sim at that time of night. You shouldn't have given me that failure to deal with. This shouldn't have happened. That should have happened. It's all your fault. And it wasn't. It was my fault. And that was the biggest learning point for me, was that, I had failed that. Nobody else had done it. An instructor is there. They want to pass you in a sim check. And I had to take ownership of it. And I really hope that that's something that people take hold of from this and understand that it's okay to make mistakes. We're always going to get things wrong. But you do need to take ownership of it, and you do need to basically pick yourself up, dust yourself down, and at some point you need to say, yeah, I got that wrong. This is what I've learned from it, and this is what I'm going to do better next time. So actually, I heard somebody say recently, fail better the next time. But actually, I couldn't fail the next one, because then there was a bit more of a spotlight on me, because I had already failed the first time. But, it was hard being in the crew room at Luton, where everybody knew I'd gone off to do my command, and I went back and I was standing at the check-in desk with a training captain, so everyone's assumption was, oh, she must be doing her command line training. And people would come up and congratulate me, and I just had to say, didn't work out this time, but it's fine, because I'm getting to fly with this dude, And I'd always make a joke of it. And deep down, I was just screaming, going, this is horrible. But I had to go through it, because it was the only way to get back on the horse, really.
But it's a real key message, what you're saying about taking ownership of that failure, owning failure. What advice would you give to anybody in a similar situation who is just persevering like you did? Or maybe even what would you say to Emma at the beginning of that course?
Well, to say to myself at the beginning of that course, I would say, what on earth are you doing going on a command course when you've got an issue with your back? You need to sort that out, because actually, even if it was only a slight niggle, it distracts you. It fills up your capacity bucket, So I would have make the command decision, which is, I can't do this at the moment. If I'd have turned around to the company at the beginning of that course and said, I'm really sorry, but I've got a back problem, can we postpone this? They would have gone, yeah, no problem. And it would have just been kicked down the park by 3 months or something until I was ready to do it. So that was a really important learning curve for me. But the other thing would just be to say, so when I initially failed, my initial response was, well, that's it. I'm never flying again. I'm obviously not supposed to be doing it. I'm not cut out for it. I've proven that by the fact I failed it. I've now got to stop flying. It's clearly a sign from above, And my husband very tolerantly said, well, if that's the way you feel, darling, then, we'll manage. We'll manage. That's the pressure word, isn't it? And then I said, well, obviously I'm not going to stop flying, but I'm not going to fly for EasyJet anymore, because they obviously don't want me. They don't value me. And I still wasn't seeing it. And then I thought to myself, yeah, because I bet every airline in the world wants to take on someone who's just failed their command course. And I realised that actually, ultimately I had to just do that. I had to pick myself up off the floor and dust myself down and go back to work. And, I think the fact that I did take ownership of it and I didn't lash out and say, this was somebody else's fault, gained me quite a lot of respect from my colleagues, and particularly from the training point of view.